Scotland's innate fear that turned family into monsters. The legend of Sawney Bean is more shocking than fiction. The 16th century in Scotland was an age marked by harsh landscapes, fragile kingdoms, and fragile lives. It was a time when the land itself seemed both breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Jagged cliffs rose over the roaring Atlantic, mist crept through the heather-covered highlands, and thick forests swallowed lonely travelers whole. It was also an age where law was weak, justice was uncertain, and survival often depended on cunning rather than righteousness. It was in this bleak world that Alexander Sawney Bean was born. His family belonged to the lowest rung of society laborers, who lived off menial, back-breaking work. His father was said to be a ditch digger and hedge cutter, a man who toiled endlessly for a few pennies, breaking his back to maintain the lands of those far wealthier than himself. For the ruling classes, men like him were nothing more than disposable tools. For their children, such a life was often a curse that chained them to poverty from birth. But Sawney Bean was no ordinary child. From the very beginning, he showed little interest in honest labor. He despised the idea of sweating under the sun for meager pay, and he looked upon the struggle of his father with contempt. Instead, he leaned towards petty theft, deception, and intimidation. In a world where law enforcement was weak and scattered, such behavior often went unpunished. Local sheriffs had little power, and isolated villages often settled matters themselves, sometimes with a rope, sometimes with a blade, and often with silence. Scotland at the time was also gripped by superstition. The fear of witchcraft and demonic forces was everywhere. Church sermons thundered about the devil's agents walking among men. Witch trials raged across Europe, and in Scotland the climate of fear was especially intense. Anyone who seemed odd, reclusive, or even slightly different could be branded a witch, shunned, or worse. The culture of folklore and whispered tales was so powerful that it shaped how people saw reality. Stories of fairies, devils, and inhuman creatures lurking in caves or forests were told around hearths at night, meant to scare children into obedience, but leaving adults secretly unsettled as well. It was in this setting that Sawney Bean's own story would grow half man, half myth. Accounts differ about his early years. Some stories say that even as a boy he showed a fascination with blood, while others his age would shy away from the slaughter of livestock. Young Sawney lingered near butchers, watching closely as animals were cut open, their blood spilling onto the ground. Some claimed he would even play with animal bones, treating them like toys. To some, it was simply the strange curiosity of a child. To others, it was an omen of what was to come. Whatever the truth, Sawney's youth hardened him into a man with little regard for human decency. Petty crime became his first education, ambushing lonely travelers on country paths, robbing small market stalls, and intimidating weaker men. But petty crime alone did not satisfy him. It wasn't enough to simply take. Deep inside, Sawney was fueled by a resentment of society itself. The world had given him nothing but poverty, scorn, and struggle, and he resolved that he would give nothing back but terror. The Scotland of Sawney's day was one where traveling was dangerous even under the best of circumstances. Roads were poorly guarded, and highwaymen and raiders lurked in the shadows. Many poor souls who vanished along the roads were assumed to have been killed by thieves, wild animals, or swallowed by the harsh terrain. In such a world, Sawney's darker appetites would find fertile ground. Some folklorists suggest that Sawney was not only driven by greed, but by something more primal. He was fascinated by the idea that humans, like animals, could be hunted, butchered, and consumed. The thought of human flesh both horrified and thrilled him. To others, this sounds like a tale exaggerated over centuries of retelling. Yet, within, the folklore of Scotland, where devils and cannibals were whispered about in the same breath, it was a believable origin for a monster dot. By the time Sawney reached manhood, he was restless. The honest path of his father disgusted him. Petty theft no longer satisfied him, and the society around him, superstitious, cruel, and unforgiving, was already prepared to brand him an outcast. Sawney did not simply slip into crime. He embraced it, nurtured it, and sought to live beyond the reach of the world altogether. It is here, in the shadow of this Scotland, that Sawney Bean's legend begins. A boy of poverty who refused to bend, a man who rejected the rules of humanity, and a name that would become immortal in whispers of horror. The land had given birth to many outlaws, thieves, and killers before. But Sawney Bean would be remembered not as just another criminal. He would be remembered as the seed of something far darker, something that lived in the caves, fed on the innocent, and stained Scotland's folklore with blood. The stage was set. The land was harsh, the law was weak, and superstition filled the air. Out of the storm, Sawney Bean emerged, not yet the monster he would become, but already walking a path that led straight into legend. The turning point in Sawney Bean's life came not fair from his scorn of work or society, but from the lady he chose to share his oust with, a lady who, in old stories, would be recalled as Black Agnes. Little is known of Agnes's genuine root. A few stories claim she had been branded a witch, a lady cast out from her town for practicing the dull expressions. Others propose she was a prostitute, solidified by a long time of disdain and mishandle, who at last deserted society through and through. A few accept she was basically a lady with a defiant soul, drawn to the same obscurity that burned interior Sawney Bean. Anything the truth. She got to be his accomplice in both cherish and atrocity. Agnes and Sawney were related spirits, both loathed the world that loathed them, and both yearned to live free from its rules. Where society saw sin, they saw freedom. Where the church lectured profound quality, they chose resistance. For two such outsiders, the union was inevitable. Together, they turned their backs on towns, and laws. They meandered the rough coast of Ayrshire, where cliffs met the thundering ocean, looking for a put where no one may discover them. Their travel driven them to Bennane Head, a rugged headland battered by the waves of the Atlantic. It was here that they found the put that would gotten to be both their asylum and their lair, a endless ocean cave. Covered up and treacherous, the cave was no conventional empty in the shake. Its entrance was limited, effectively neglected by bystanders. But interior, it extended about 200 yards profound into the soil. At tall tide, the ocean gulped the entrance totally, fixing it off from the exterior world. To any traveler, the put looked like nothing more than a shadow in the cliffside. But to Sawney and Agnes, it was perfect. They made the cave their domestic. To begin with, it was nothing but soggy stone, trickling water, and haziness so thick. It appeared lively. The dividers were cold, smooth with dampness, and the disgust noticed of salt and decay. However, the exceptionally distressingness of the put was what made it perfect. No lawman would wander so distant. No villager would readily enter such a put. The ocean itself was their gatekeeper dot by torchlight. Sawney and Agnes started to shape the cavern into something decent. They built unrefined resting regions from driftwood and stolen covers. They lit fires in pits of stone, filling the cave with smoke that clung to the ceiling like a moment roof. They rummaged anything supplies they might steal, pots, blades, barrels, and reserved them in the rough hollows. The cave, once noiseless and untouched, started to reverberate with the sounds of life, whispers, strides, and the crackle of fire. But the cave was more than fair a domestic. It was a covering up put, a post, and in the long run a slaughterhouse dot. It is said that dark Agnes brought with her information of herbs and simple medication. She scavenged among the cliffs and woodlands for plants, making poultices for wounds and bizarre concoctions to keep sickness at narrows. Sawney, in the interim, developed bolder in his robberies. At night, he would stalk travelers along forlorn ways, ransacking them of nourishment, clothing, and devices. What started as unimportant robbery before long turned to murder had to begin. With the killings may have been practical a way to kill witnesses, but exceptionally rapidly, slaughtering got to be portion of their way of life. The cave was a put where shouts were gulped by stone and tide. Here, distant from prying eyes, Sawney and Agnes reveled their darkest wants without fear of discovery. Their union bore children, many children. Fables records that they had 8 children and 6 girls. In the confinement of the cave, these children developed up knowing nothing of the exterior world's ethical quality or laws. Their instruction came, as it were, from their guardians. Sawney instructed them how to snare and slaughter. Agnes instructed them how to survive in mystery. Together they raised a brood in haziness, forming them not into men and ladies, but into predators. And as the children developed, the clan confronted a issue. With no contact with the exterior world, where would the another era come from? Sawney and Agnes given the reply themselves. Inbreeding. Children took sisters, girls bore children from brothers, and the family tree developed, turned, and spoiled. In time, the cave would be domestic to a clan of handfuls, all bound by blood, all born from mystery and sin, but all of that was still to come. For presently, in these early, a long time, Sawney Bean and Dark Agnes laid the establishment of a legend. They had carved out a covered-up kingdom, one that seemed not become to by law or confidence. The cave was not essentially a shelter, it was a womb, and inside its soggy, resounding chambers, something tremendous was gestating. By day, the cave was quiet, covered up by the tide. By night, its tenants blended, inching out into the world to take, to slaughter, and to bolster. Those who passed along the coast and afterward a long time would swear they listened bizarre sounds from the cliff's low chuckling carried on the wind, or the flash of torchlight in the rocks where no town stood. A few claimed they saw shadows, moving against the ocean shower, shapes as well tall as well bent, to be human. The truth was darker still. Sawney Bean and Dark Agnes had chosen their banish, and in doing so, they had made a space where no law connected and no god was worshipped. Here they were free to murder, free to nourish, free to raise their brood in rebellion of each taboo. And so the cave got to be legend, not just to empty in the rocks, but the origin of one of history's most scandalous plans. From its profundities, the rule of dread was, as it were, fair starting. The cave at Bennane Head, once a asylum for two untouchables, before long started to reverberate with the cries of infant children. Sawney Bean and Dark Agnes had built more than fair a hideout. They had made the establishments of a tradition, however not at all like any respectable family or clan of Scotland. This tradition was born in shadows, bolstered by blood, and debased from its exceptionally roots. According to legend, Sawney and Agnes raised a brood of 8 children, and 6 girls. In the obscurity of the cavern, these children developed up without the faintest touch of profound quality, without introduction to the laws of God or man. They were not baptized in the church. They were not instructed the sacred texts. They were not educated in the ways of legitimate labor. Instead, their lessons were instructed by their guardians: how to stalk travelers at night, how to use an edge, how to hush a shout. Sometime recently, it come to the open air that the children knew nothing of benevolence. Their bedtime songs were the shouts of casualties brought into the cavern. Their toys were blades, bones, and the leftovers of stolen products. By torchlight, they learned to carve tissue as a butcher would carve a sheep. Blood was not something to fear. It was something to savor. Yet, as the children developed more seasoned, the address of the clan's future emerged. For a family cut off from the exterior world, how might their bloodline proceed? The reply for Sawney and Agnes was simple. They would take their possessed children as accomplices, and their children would take one another. What the exterior world would call huge, the Beans called survival. Brothers lay with sisters. Fathers fathered children by their possessed girls. The family tree did not department outward. It twisted in upon itself like a coiled wind, eating up its claim tail. From these perverted unions came modern eras. 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, all born in the cave, all born of bloodlines, as of now twisted. Folklore demands that this inbreeding cleared out its check, not as it were on the minds, but moreover on the bodies of the clan. A few claim the children had unusual animalistic features, two large eyes that gleamed in the dull, bent appendages or expressions that appeared more mammoth than human. Others accepted they looked flawlessly conventional, but carried inside them something distant, more awful. A total non-attendance of sympathy, a void where human soul ought to have been. Within the cave, the family developed like a covered-up colony. What had started with two got to be handfuls. Their voices filled the cavern, giggling, cries, contentions, and the throaty sounds of devouring. The once empty of stone got to be a bustling sanctum of predators. For untouchables, the thought of inbreeding was loathsome, and unspeakable, unthinkable. But for the Bean clan, it was basically life. They knew no other way, no other bond. Their family was their whole universe, and inside that universe there was no disgrace. Children played among butchered bodies as casually as others might play among sheaves or in town greens. Adore, sex, birth, and passing were all snared in the same unending cycle, one era nourishing and birthing the next dot. It is said that the children of this perverted brood were indeed more merciless than their guardians. They had never known the exterior world, had never been mellowed by indeed a short-lived sea of thoughtfulness. Raised on human tissue, they saw travelers not as individual creatures, but as prey. They learned the craftsmanship of snare as others learned to walk. By youth, they were taking an interest in strikes nearby Sawney and Agnes, dragging casualties into the cave to be butchered. The development of the family, too, implied the development of its starvation. More mouths to bolster implied more travelers to slaughter. Where once Sawney and Agnes struck cautiously, the more youthful era developed striking, lurking the streets in packs. Their casualties expanded in number, their attacks more brave. Whole bunches of travelers vanished, never to be seen again. Inside the cave, the environment got to be bizarre. By torchlight, the family worked like butchers in a slaughterhouse, carving tissue, salting meat, and bubbling bones for marrow. Children chewed at disjoined appendages as if they were basic cuts of venison. The dividers, once reverberating with the crash of the tide, presently reverberated with devouring, giggling, and the intermittent shouts of those not, however, dead. When the blades started their work, and however, to the Bean clan, this was not frightfulness. This was domestic. Their forbidden bonds gave them dependability, as it were, to one another. Pariahs were nothing more than cattle, nourishment to keep, the family solid. The cave was their fortification, their world, and their womb of monstrosity. As a long time passed, the legend says the family's appearance got to be progressively wild. A few claimed they be seen from a remote place at sunset, moving over the rocks like a pack of wolves, their faces spread with blood, their hair tangled with ocean splash, their chuckling carried by the wind. To travelers, they were apparitions. To villagers, they were, as it were, rumors. To each other, they were family, joined together in a bond fashioned by blood, honed by blades, and fixed in darkness. By the time their numbers swelled to about 50, the Beans were no longer only a family, they were a clan that lived by kill, bred by inbreeding, and flourished in the shadows of Ayrshire's cliffs. And so, in the womb of that cave, era after era of haziness was born. Sawney and Agnes had not only surrendered society, they had made their claim bent adaptation of it, a society where laws were supplanted by blood ties, where ethical quality was eaten up with substance, and where the as-it-were future was the perpetual cycle of inbreeding and slaughter. This was the genuine frightfulness of Sawney Bean, not as it were that he murdered, but that he raised a family who knew nothing else, and in their obliviousness got to be something less than human, and more than beast. The clan was prepared, the cave was full, and before long the rule of fear would start. By the time Sawney Bean's brood had increased into handfuls, the family's starvation may no longer be fulfilled by trivial robbery or incidental strikes. What started as survival had changed into a realm of fear. The coastline of Ayrshire, once forlorn but acceptable, got to be extend of arrive, whispered almost in fear. Travelers who wandered as well near regularly vanished, gulped not by the ocean, but by the cave-dwelling clan that snuck in its shadows. The Bean clan worked with the accuracy of predators. Their attacks were not arbitrary, but carefully arranged. At night, beneath the cover of moonlight or storm, bunches of the family risen from the mouth of their cave, their uncovered feet cushioned quietly over the rocks. Their eyes, acclimated to haziness, shined faintly in the torchlight. They part into chasing parties, each driven by one of Sawney's children or grandsons, whereas the ladies and more youthful children remained behind to get ready fires and hone blades. Their strategy was brutal, but compelling. They would stalk travelers, merchants, partners, or straightforward wanderers waiting until the casualty had strayed into a forlorn way or destroy extent of street. At that point, in a sudden surge, they assaulted. Overpowering numbers guaranteed, there was no elude. A few casualties were butchered quickly, throats opening in the dough. Others were bound and choked, dragged back lively into the cavern. The entrance of the cave, concealed by ocean and stone, gulped their prey entire. Interior, lights bursted, fires crackled, and the family's alcove changed into a slaughterhouse. Casualties were stripped, their belonging heaped into loads that sparkled with stolen gold, weapons, and dress. At that point came the butchery. The Beans had idealized the craftsmanship of dismantling. With rough blades and cleavers, they carved substance from bone as flawlessly as a butcher would carve lamb. Blood doused into the stones, shaping dull. Stains that never washed absent, indeed with the tide. The choicest cuts of meat were simmered over open flares, filling the cavern with the stench of cooked human substance. Other parts were salted, smoked, or salted in barrels, guaranteeing a supply of nourishment amid leaner times. Bones, ligament, and organs littered the ground. A few were hurled into the ocean, carried absent by the tide, as it were to wash up on adjacent shorelines. It was these horrible discoveries, dismembered appendages, half-eaten corpses, that to begin with mixed doubt among villagers. They accepted wild creatures or ocean creatures were dependable. Few challenged to envision the truth that human predators, not mammoths, were the culprits. The family's craving was unquenchable. Men, ladies, and children alike got to be casualties. No traveler was saved. Their assaults developed bolder, some of the time focusing on bunches. Whole wagons were trapped, their travelers butchered where they fell. Survivors were uncommon, for the beans cleared out no witnesses. Those who stood up to were hacked, separated on the roadside, their remains carried back in sacks dot inside the cave. Devouring was a odd custom. The family sat together around fires, tearing at simmered substance with their teeth. Blood ran down their chins as they snickered, drank, and celebrated their slaughters. Children chewed on bones as if they were toys. The cave got to be a bazaar, spoof of a feast corridor, where each supper was an update of their dismissal of humanity. For the beans, cannibalism was more than survival, it was control. To expend a man was to rule him totally. It was verification that they were no longer bound by the rules of the exterior world. They had made their claim law. Murder, devour, survive, the rule of fear spread past the quick coastline. Word of lost travelers undulated through Scotland. Families grieved, cherished, ones who never returned from ventures. Dealers started to fear the streets of Ayrshire, leaning toward longer, more secure courses. Towns whispered around bizarre vanishings, but without confirmation, doubt fell upon the off-base people. Innocent owners and travelers were denounced of burglary and kill, lynchings taken after. The equity framework, frail and disorganized, collapsed beneath the weight. Each vanishing made more suspicion, and however the killings never stopped, the beans flourished on this chaos. Each wrong allegation was a shield for their possessed wrongdoings. The more others were faulted, the more undetectable they got to be. Sawney, tricky as ever, knew that dread itself was their most noteworthy weapon. The individuals dreaded shadows, beasts, and one another, never realizing the genuine beasts lived in the cliffs by the sea. Over the decades, the Bean clan culminated their strategies. They moved like ghosts, struck like wolves, and vanished like fog. Their cave filled with riches stolen from their victims' jewelry, clothing, weapons, and gold sufficient to enhance a little town. However, they utilized none of it in the exterior world. To show up in towns with wealth would chance presentation. And so the heaps of treasure decayed in the haziness, futile images of covetousness without purpose. But indeed, treasure was auxiliary. What really characterized the clan was their starvation. To nourish was to live. To slaughter was to flourish. And the more their numbers developed, the more casualties were required. It was said that over the long time, The beans killed and expended hundreds of people, some gauges rising to over 1,000. Whether this number was truth or legend, it captured the scale of their rule. Few challenged travel alone close Bennane Head, less still returned to tell the tale. The cave itself bore witness to their viciousness. Its dividers were darkened with smoke, its floor sticky with dried blood. Heaps of bones lay in loads, a few chewed down to nothing. The stench of passing hung overwhelming, a scent that no tide might cleanse. However, to the beans, it was Homa, domestic built on shouts and recolored with flesh dot, and so, for about 25 a long time, the Bean clan terrorized Scotland. Covered up by tide, protected by superstition, and enabled by their numbers, they ruled the night. To travelers, the streets got to be frequented. To villagers, the vanishings were curses. To history, got to be one of the darkest legends of cannibalism ever told. The rule of dread was unbroken. But legends tell us each predator takes off follows. Each mystery inevitably disentangles. And the beans, inebriated on blood and invulnerable in their cave, were around to make a botch. For a long time, the Bean clan's cave remained covered up, its repulsions fixed behind tides and stone. However, the exterior world was not dazed at their presence, only insensible of its genuine frame. What the beans cleared out behind got to be their loudest confession, the bones and remains of their victims. When the tide cleared out, it now and then carried with it pieces of the dead. Anglers found appendages washed up on shorelines, chewed bones tangled in ocean growth, or heads rolling aground like twisted offerings from the ocean. The villagers whispered of ocean creatures, kelpies, and devils that frequented the coast. Few may acknowledge the easier, darker truth that people seem to be competent of such carnage. At to begin with, these revelations were rejected as mishaps of the ocean. Maybe mariners had suffocated, their bodies broken upon the rocks. But as the number of lost travelers developed, doubt turned elsewhere. Innkeepers along the forlorn streets bore the brunt of the fear. Where else, the villagers contemplated, would a traveler disappear if not from the hotels where they stopped? Families of the lost requested answers. Hotels were struck, landlords beaten or hanged. A few were dragged into courts and blamed of ransacking and killing their visitors. Whole families were crushed beneath the weight of suspicion. Yet, no matter how numerous innocents were rebuffed, the vanishings did not stop. Merchants, as well, fell beneath investigation. Traveling vendors were charged of attracting clients into traps. Drifters were adjusted up and executed. In the eyes of the panicked, each stranger was a suspect. The streets got to be battlegrounds of suspicion, where individuals looked upon one another not with belief, but with fear. The equity framework, as of now frail in rustic Scotland, disintegrated in courage beneath the strain. Trials were fast, prove unstable, and discipline brutal. Handfuls of innocents were lynched or burned, their passings, as it were, including to the count of unnecessary gore. Each untrue execution protected the genuine offenders, who sat in their cavern devouring, untouched and unseen, The beings flourished in this environment of chaos. Each untrue allegation worked in their favor. They tuned into the rumors with happiness, taunting the villagers who faulted one another. For them it was verification that society's laws were delicate, effectively smashed beneath fear. They, more neighbors turned against neighbors, the more liberated the clan was to precede its harvest. Sawney, tricky as ever, energized intensity among his children and grandsons. They struck with certainty, knowing that somebody else would bear the fault. If a wagon vanished, the whispers would say, "The landlord murdered them." If bones washed shorewards, individuals murmured, "The ocean has taken them." It got to be a cycle of frightfulness and lost equity. Travelers went lost. Villagers blamed the off-base individuals. Innocents were rebuffed. The genuine executioners observed from the shadows, chuckling in the dark. The suspicion spread past Ayrshire. Word traveled over Scotland that something unnatural frequented the streets. Clerics talked of curses. Anthems were sung around spirits that dragged travelers into the ocean. Moms cautioned their children not to meander, for the devil's brood would take them, but not everybody was persuaded of the powerful. A few started to suspect that something more natural was at work, that outlaws, maybe, were chasing travelers. Little state armies were raised to watch the streets. However, the beings were as well intelligent. They struck in places watches seem not reach, vanishing into the cliffs some time recently. Any caution might be raised as the long time passed. Fear turned into lose hope. Whole communities were recolored by doubt. Neighbors spied on one another, believed broken by the consistent risk of passing. The lost seemed no longer be checked on one hand or two. Stories claimed that hundreds of travelers had vanished without a trace, and still the beings encouraged. Their cave developed fat with ruins, their clan duplicated, their starvation unending. For them, the frieze exterior was a source of entertainment. They saw it as verification of their prevalence. Whereas towns tore themselves separated, the beings stood joined together, bound by inbreeding, by starvation, and by a shared insubordination of each human law. But in spite of the fact that the clan accepted themselves untouchable, the breaks were starting to appear. Frieze might, as it were, veil the truth for so long. The heap of lost names was as well awesome, the number of untrue executions as well numerous. Scotland itself was trembling, and it was as it were a matter of time. Sometime recently a survivor would emerge, a voice to puncture the mist of lies and superstition, a witness who seemed drag the beings into the light. For decades, the Bean clan had flourished in shadows, undetectable and untouchable. The coast of Ayrshire whispered with rumors of lost travelers, but no one had challenged go up against the genuine source. That is, until the night when destiny intervened, a night when a single act of resistance would uncover the whole clan. The story starts with a traveling couple returning from a reasonable in a adjacent town. The man was solid and cautious, the lady watchful but trusting. They took the forlorn way along the cliffs, uninformed that the Agnes itself harbored predators distantlier than wolves or brigand, zat. It was a commonplace night for the Bean clan. Lights flashed along the rocks, shadows moving like stalking mammoths. Children and grandsons squatted among the heather, blades honed, holding up. When the couple neared a limit pass, the trap struck. Screams tore the night, suppressed by the wind and the rocks. The family moved like shadows, encompassing the match with frightening effectiveness. They dragged them into the cave, aim on including them to the long list of casualties. For to begin with time and numerous a long time, be that as it may, they experienced resistance that astounded them. The spouse battled back with a savagery none of the Beans had expected. He bit, kicked, and struck, denying to yield. In the chaos, he overseen to break free from the starting get a handle on of two aggressors, running toward the cliffside. The family sought after, blades raised, but in the battle they were constrained to withdraw incidentally, taking off the couple alive. The spouse, startled but unbroken, fled to the closest town and summoned the nearby judge. His story was met with skepticism had to begin with. How might such a frightfulness exist? However, the escalated of his fear, the detail of his account, and the consistency of the story of lost travelers persuaded the officer to act. Word spread rapidly. Witnesses were accumulated. Maps of vanishing locales were compared. Gradually, the pieces started to frame a coherent pattern, a organize of vanished travelers, all followed to the cliff's closed Bennane Head. The judge realized this was no standard wrongdoing ring. This was something unprecedented. The survivor portrayed the cave in chilling detail. He talked of dividers lined with bones, racks holding salted substance, fires lit beneath trickling ceilings, and the bizarre devouring of human bodies. He related seeing children bite on what might, as it were, be depicted as human remains, the giggling of the clan reverberating through the cavern. His declaration affirmed what had been, as it were, whispered rumors. Authorities, driven by ruler James VI himself, were compelled to act. A illustrious manhunt was organized, one not at all like any Scotland had seen some time recently. 400 warriors went with, by prepared dogs, scoured the cliffs and coastline. Maps of the caves were drawn from survivor accounts. Scouts were sent to screen tides and track designs of disappearances. The survivor's declaration was basic. Without it, the Bean's cave might have remained covered up uncertainly. His nitty-gritty relating permitted the specialists to pinpoint the correct area of the sanctuary, giving the, as it were, opportunity for justice. It was moreover to begin with time untouchables, completely gotten a handle on the scale of the Bean clan. The survivor's story indicated not fair at kill, but at orderly butcher over decades. They had expected ambushes, coordinated killings, and culminated a strategy of concealment that permitted them to work undetected. The survivors elude, smashed the figment of invincibility. Villagers, upon hearing the account, were alarmed. Numerous were irate at themselves for questioning the reports. for rebuffing guiltless owners and travelers. The wave of freeze and lost equity that had held the farmland presently turned to fear and a terrible assurance. The Bean clan was real and they were coming. The survivor got to be the living confirmation of repulsions that had long been whispered approximately in legends. His metal had uncovered a beast that had outsmarted society for decades. And however, the risk remained inescapable. For Sawney Bean and his brood, the interest had started, and the world they had avoided for so long was at last at their doorstep. This single elude checked the starting of the conclusion. For the to begin with time, the specialists had not as it were a area, but moreover a first-hand account of the clan's strategies, their cave, and the scale of their violations. What had been myth, rumor, and fear got to be verifiable reality. Soon the full might of the Scottish crown would meet. On Bennane Head, and the dull chapter of the Bean clan's unchecked rule of fear would enter its last act. The story of Sawney Bean's clan, long whispered along the coasts and slopes of Ayrshire, at last come to the ears of Lord James VI of Scotland. The frightfulness portrayed by the survivor was so bizarre that it requested regal consideration. The ruler, a man known for his interest approximately both equity and the grotesque, took individual intrigue in the matter. A manhunt of phenomenal scale was organized. 400 troopers, hand-picked for their expertise and teach, were accumulated. These were not conventional volunteer army. They were prepared men with encounter and following, combat, and survival along Scotland's misleading coastlines. Going with them were hound dogs, animals eminent for their capacity to identify human. Fragrance over long separations. The king's declare was clear. The Beans were to be captured, dead or lively, and their sanctuary destroyed. The survivor's account served as an outline. They portrayed the cliffs, the covered-up ways, the spiked rocks, and most vitally, the mystery cave of Bennane Head. The specialists drawn closer with caution, for the landscape was as unsafe as the offenders they looked for. Storms lashed the coast, and waves beat against cliffs, as in spite of the fact that nature itself looked for to secure the hideout. The officers moved in carefully, spreading out in groups, lights in hand, weapons prepared. Scouts climbed the rough cliffs, whereas hunting dogs sniffed the ground for the faintest follow of human fragrance. The clansmen, be that as it may, were tricky. Eras of survival in the wild had made them slippery, and the specialists found themselves confronting a maze of cliffs, rocks, and covered-up gullies. Days of looking yielded small. The tide regularly blocked the entrance to the cave, driving the men to hold up for moo water. When they at long last come to the mouth, the air was ghostly. The cave's entrance, half hidden by rocks and ocean growth, gave no imply of the repulsions. Inside, however, the stench of rot hung in the air, a impactful caution that something awful awaited inside. The cave extended more distant than anybody had envisioned. Lights flashed against dividers darkened by smoke. Bones littered the floor, heaped in bizarre hills. The sounds of dribbling water, reverberated through the burrows, blending with the faintest follows of human shouts that appeared to wait indeed after decades. Racks of cured human tissue, devices of butchery, and stolen merchandise affirmed decades of unchecked savagery. The warriors were stunned, but they squeezed on. The Lord himself supposedly gone to the location afterward, in spite of the fact that authentic accounts shift on the correct, subtle elements. He was said to have watched the cave from its mouth, noticing the unfathomable scale of the abominations. For a minute, indeed solidified, men delayed, overcome by the sheer greatness of human depravity. Sawney Bean and his family were found in pockets, more profound inside the cave. The soldiers' nearness startled them, but the clan, prepared by eras of survival and savagery, endeavored to battle back. Clashes broke out, blades clashed against swords, and the echoes of battle bounced through the stone hallways. The Beans were tricky, utilizing limit entries and trap strategies to their advantage. Yet the numbers of the king's men were overpowering. Dogs followed their fragrance tenaciously, driving the family to withdraw in courage into the maze. In the long run, the clan was cornered, caught in a chamber profound inside the cave where elude was impossible. The specialists had arranged for this minute. Chains, ropes, and restrictions were prepared. Each family part was seized, bound, and isolated. The frightfulness that had long been myth was presently captured, its individuals defenseless beneath the look of the law, the revelation of the cave checked, the conclusion of decades of dread. For the two begin with time, the scale of the Bean clan's violations was completely realized. Heaps of bones, protected tissue, and stolen belonging told the story of hundreds of casualties, all devoured in the obscurity. The clan, once imperceptible and invulnerable, was presently uncovered to the light of day, and the specialist of the crown, the capture, sent shockwaves all through Scotland. Villagers who had long dreaded vanishing travelers at last caught on the truth. Landlords and shippers who had endured wrong allegations were vindicated. The myth of the invulnerable cannibals, the whispers of powerful frightfulness, had been demonstrated terrifyingly real. Sawney, Bean, Dark Agnes, their children, and grandchildren, dozens in total, were brought to equity in a quick and brutal reaction, their destiny a chilling conclusion to a rule of dread that had endured for decades. The story of the illustrious chase, the plummet into the cave, and forging the disclosure of incredible frightfulness would be recollected in old stories for centuries to come. The minute the warriors crossed the limit of Bennane Head's covered-up cave, the genuine scale of Sawney Bean's outrage got to be horrifyingly clear. What had once been a whispered legend presently stood up to them in unmistakable, bizarre shape. Each inch of the cave bore witness to decades of unchecked savagery, unreasonable family development, and human corruption that outperformed imagination. The entrance itself was misleadingly calm. Trickling water resounded delicately from the roof, and the scent of salt and damp stone filled the discuss. However, underneath that conventional facade lay a stench that hit the warriors like a physical blow, a mix of spoiling substance, blood, and rot that had rotted for a long time. Numerous men stunned at to begin with, choking and spewing, but the require for equity constrained them deeper as they continued, the genuine frightfulness risen. Appendages hung from snares inserted in the dividers, dried and hardened like meat. In a butcher's shop, barrels of cured human tissue lined contract passages, their substance protected in brine as in spite of the fact that the beans had looked for to make a stockpile of odd arrangements for the clan's future. A few remains were in part cooked, others crude, and all shown the fastidious care of butchers, or maybe than thoughtless killers. The officers lurched over heaps of bones. Smashed skulls, broken ribs, and chewed femurs lay in piles over the cavern floor. The dividers were streaked with blood-ancient stains darkened over time, however still unmistakably human. Lights glinted against these grotesque shows, casting shadows that bent and writhed as if the cave itself were lively, a tremendous substance nourishing on fear. Amid the chaos of passing, the plundered belonging of endless travelers included a bleak layer of reality. Adornments, weapons, coins, and clothing were scattered all through the cave, proof of the clan's precise loot. Each thing was an update of lives cut brief, of families cleared out lamenting, of guiltlessness expended. The size of the violations was overpowering. The troopers realized that they were strolling through an exhibition hall of frightfulness, curated by human hands. Children, as well, were portion of this bad dream. Cadavers of the youthful, casualties of both parental disregard and dynamic butcher, were among the heaps. The clan had raised its offspring in the same shadowed environment, a few learning to devour on human substance. Indeed, some time recently they may walk. Warriors detailed seeing apparatuses designed for dissection, toys carved from bone, and rough preparing actualizes outlined to educate children the strategies of snare and murder. Beyond the quick carnage, the cave itself told a story of organized brutality. Diverse chambers showed up to serve particular purposes, one for butcher, one for devouring, one for conservation. Fires had been built deliberately to give light without smoke clouding the work zones. Bones were carefully stacked and dried. Barrels were labeled roughly with chalk markings. The format recommended strategy, not franticness, unnerving insights behind the tremendous acts. Some troopers claimed that indeed the shadows appeared lively, moving in the flashing torchlight. Whispers of past shouts appeared to reverberate down the passages. The scent, the sights, the sheer scale of the remains hundreds of a long time of human clever and remorselessness condensed into a single, sprawling underground den broke the nerves of the most grounded men. Numerous collapsed, incapable to proceed, whereas others squeezed forward out of obligation and dread. Yet, for all its frightfulness, the cave, moreover, uncovered the inventiveness of the Bean clan. They had lived undisturbed for decades, raising children and supporting themselves completely through viciousness and clever. The format of the cave, the conservation of meat, the preparing of progressive generations all talked to a family not simply surviving, but flourishing in obscurity. It was a civilization rearranged, where profound quality was supplanted with predation and familial devotion abrogated all. Other bonds dot the disclosure stunned, not as it were officers, but to the crown. News of the cave's substance come to ruler. James V., who allegedly communicated both incredulity and interest. The scale of the horror, the combination of cannibalism, inbreeding, kill, and precise planning was past anything chroniclers had envisioned. Old stories presently met reality in an alarming crossing point, and the story of the Bean clan was cemented in history, immortalized by the odd proof some time recently them. The repulsions of Bennane Head would afterward motivate stories over Scotland and past, numbers, cautionary stories, and, centuries afterward, movies and books almost cannibalistic clans sneaking in the wild. But for the warriors who entered the cave that day, the legend had finished not with a story, but with the irrefutable locate of human corruption made flesh. Every step more profound into the cave strengthened one unpreventable truth. The Bean clan had not been a myth. They were genuine. They had existed. And they had flourished in segregation for decades, taking off behind a bequest of fear, passing, an incredible frightfulness that would frequent Scottish legends for centuries to come. The revelation of Bennane Head's covered-up cave affirmed what had long frequented the creative energy of Scotland. Sawney Bean and his clan were no myth. The survivors' stories, already expelled as embellishment, presently coordinated the twisted reality, sometime recently the soldier's eyes, was proof of centuries of kill and cannibalism. The specialist moved quickly to order the harshest equity imaginable. Once the clan was secured inside the profundities of the cave, their capture was deliberate. Men, ladies, and children were isolated, limited with chains and ropes. The warriors had learned from the survivors' account that these individuals were unsafe, clever, and competent of viciousness indeed in confinement. Each safety measure was taken. The Bean clan, in spite of their eras of non-domesticated tricky, was at long last cornered. What taken after was the formal declaration of their destiny. The violations of Sawney Bean and his relatives were exceptional. They had terrorized the Scottish farmland for decades, slaughtering hundreds and taking off communities in ceaseless fear. The decision was quick. Outline execution without delay. Lawful point of reference may not include such abomination. The Crown declared their discipline directly. The men of the clan confronted the most brutal of closes. They were to begin with castrated, a typical act implied to separate the continuation of their bloodline. At that point, their limbs, hands, and feet were severed. At last they were drained to passing, their backbones streaming into the same soil that had seen decades of their predation. Each act of execution was considered a measured revenge for the centuries of frightfulness they had wrought. The ladies and children, in spite of the fact that more youthful and in some cases considered less punishable, were not saved the dread of their discipline. Accounts change, but one common form relates that they were bolted interior the cave itself and burned lively. A few sources propose that explosive may have been utilized to seal the cave for all time, clearing out the clan's remains buried in the exceptionally sanctuary that had protected them for decades. In either situation, the discipline was add up to, taking off no chance for survival or escape. The executions were both discipline and display. Villagers already terrorized by vanishings and untrue allegations seeing the conclusion of the clan. Numerous had misplaced family individuals or companions to the being's predation. For them, the brutal equity ordered by the crown given closure, a bleak consolation that the rule of fear had finished. However, indeed, as they observed, a sense of incredulity waited. How may human creatures commit acts so huge, so efficient? That words seem scarcely contain the horror? The consequence of the executions undulated through Scottish society. Landlords and travelers already blamed were vindicated. Villagers modified their communities, but the shadow of the Bean clan waited. For decades, coastal ways and forlorn streets carried whispers of what had happened at Bennane Head. Guardians cautioned children not fear of wolves or brigands, but of the repulsions that people themselves might enact. Historians and chroniclers talked about the occasions for eras. A few claimed the story was overstated, a piece of anti-Scottish publicity implied to startle or engage. Others demanded on the veracity of the accounts, indicating to the survivor's declaration, the soldiers' reports, and the unambiguous proof of the cave itself. Whether completely genuine or somewhat myth, the story of Sawney Bean got to be a cautionary story approximately the extremes of human debasement and the results of unchecked isolation. Even in passing, the Bean clan cleared out a bequest. Bennane Head remained scandalous. Society melodies, anthems, and stories of cannibal clans spread all through Scotland and into Europe. Specialists, scholars, and inevitably producers drew motivation from the legend. Movies like The Slopes have eyes, and incalculable books owe their presence to the persevering frightfulness to begin with chronicled on the rough cliffs of Ayrshire. The execution of the Beans checked the conclusion of their physical nearness, but not their social engrave. Their violations got to be a reflect of humanity's darkest potential, a update that confinement, remorselessness, and ethical debasement can create hulks that history cannot overlook. The cave, once a domestic, got to be a tomb, and the world, in spite of the fact that free from the quick danger, may never disregard the rule of Sawney Bean. With the capture and execution of Sawney Bean and his whole clan, the prompt danger to Scotland was quenched. However, the story of Bennane Head did not disappear with their passings. Instead, it got to be immortalized in fables, writing, and, well, known culture, frequenting creative impulses for centuries. The repulsions of the Bean clan risen above the physical domain, getting to be a persevering moral story for human debasement and the delicacy of society. The legend of Sawney Bean spread rapidly. Villagers told stories by the fireside of the tremendous family living underneath the cliffs, cautioned children not to meander as well distant. Researchers talked about the truth. Was this a genuine family or an ethical story increased into myth? Students of history famous the plausibility of embellishment, recommending that anti-Scottish estimation in Britain may have made a difference shape the account. Indeed, if parts were created, the bit of frightfulness was undeniable. A family, supported by inbreeding, kill, and cannibalism for decades. Literary works before long drew on the legend. Sawney Bean got to be an image of the huge other prowling at the edges of civilization. Gothic books, penny dreadfuls, and afterward frightfulness writing referenced his deeds, frequently decorating the horrible subtle elements. The original of the separated, cannibalistic clan, covered up from society, however able of annihilating savagery, got to be a repeating theme in storytelling. In cinema. The Bean bequest is unmistakable. Movies such as The Slopes Have Eyes and various frightfulness establishments resound the account of separation, inbreeding, and savage viciousness. These stories draw from the same primal fear, the dread of humankind turned internal, making beasts from those implied to support and ensure. In quintessence, Sawney Bean's cave got to be an outline for frightfulness, where the familiar family domestic kinship was modified into odd malevolence. Beyond excitement, the legend carries symbolic weight. History specialists and clinicians have inspected the story as a ponder in social confinement and ethical rot. The Bean's presence illustrates how disjoined associations to society, combined with unchecked control and survival instinctual, can create behaviors that abuse all standards of human morals. It is a cautionary story, an update that civilization, law, and communal oversight are basic to avoid human monstrosity. In Scottish culture, the story serves as both old stories and authentic interest. Coastal guides say Bennane Head, indicating to the cliffs and covered-up caves, describing stories to sightseers and local people alike. The story endures in neighborhood memory as a legend that is portion myth, portion verifiable plausibility, and entirely terrifying. Even the dialogue of equity is reflected in the bequest. The extraordinary discipline of the clan, whether completely precise or mostly overstated, underscores society's reaction to incredible wrongdoing. It reflects a time when legitimate structures might be overpowered, when fables and official activity entwined, and when the line between history and legend obscured. The executions got to be portion of the account, outlining both the frightfulness of the wrongdoings and the seriousness of the human reaction to such acts. Modern groups of onlookers, isolated by centuries, proceed to discover interest in Sawney. The story reverberates since it challenges the limits of human creative energy and ethical quality. It strengthens us to stand up to the awkward truth that beneath certain circumstances, human creatures are able of acts distant, darker, than characteristic predators. The Beans are alarming not fair sense of their activities, but since they were human family individuals, guardians, children twisted by environment, confinement, and choice into a bound together constraint of destruction. In scholastic talks, the legend prompts questions almost prove myth-making and social memory. How much of Sawney Bean is real, and how much is legends? Indeed, history specialists who question the chronicled exactness concede the story's social control. It is a account that has molded frightfulness traditions, affected narrating procedures, and inserted itself in the mental scene of fear. Ultimately, the bequest of Sawney Bean is multidimensional. It is a story of frightfulness, a cautionary moral story, and a social touchstone. It reminds us of the lean lacquer of civilization, the potential obscurity of human nature, and the persevering control of narrating to capture fear in ways that outlast time itself. The cave at Bennane Head, in spite of the fact that long deserted, proceeds to resound in collective imagination, a put where history, myth, and fear focalize, guaranteeing that the story of Sawney Bean will never be forgotten. The legend perseveres. Not sense of certainty, but sense of the all-inclusive fear it encapsulates. That humankind, if disjoined from profound quality, society, and law, can plummet into unfathomable haziness. Sawney Bean remains a frequenting figure, both authentic and mythic, an image of what prowls when the most essential human taboos are smashed, and an update that a few stories are as well tremendous to blur.